Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I did this chimpanzee drawing in graphite. Now as always I do like to start with the eyes. This is where the main emotion and expression stems from, so I do like to make sure that I've got that correct before I consider any other part of the portrait. Now this drawing, it isn't massive, it's only an 8 by 14 inch, so I do need to be realistic with how much detail I can include. Now that being said, as long as the right layering process and pencil technique are used, we can achieve a high level of realism on a smaller scale. And this is something that I'm going to focus this video on. Now as I start to progress through the layering process here, you can see that my first consideration is to get the main shape of the eye accurate. I'm not focusing on any kind of detail, but I do want to make sure that I've got any shading in the correct place. This is really going to help establish more of that three-dimensional sphere shape that we want to capture when drawing any eye. Now predominantly this is going to involve really focusing on that light source. Is there a bright highlight that's visible? And in this case there was, and you can see I'm allowing the white of the paper to show through. Now this is a really good way in ensuring that your highlights are as bright as they possibly can be. It's going to then help to enhance more of that contrast when our darker values are established. And that's what I'm starting to begin with at this stage. So now I'm happy with the shape and the size of the eye. This is where I can now really enhance more of those darker values. Now as I do this, the shape of the eye is going to transform. We're going to capture even more shape here, and I want to be making sure that I'm studying any slight reflection in the eye without forcing too much detail. Now on smaller portraits or smaller sections of a portrait, if we try to add in too much detail and we lose the layers underneath, the portrait will actually look less realistic. So in some situations here, more detail doesn't necessarily mean more realism. So getting that balance right is crucial. Now the next stage of the drawing was to focus on the skin around the eye. Now this is certainly where the portrait could become more overwhelming. There is a lot of creases that we need to capture here, and this could make us sit and stare at our reference photo not knowing where to begin. Now my biggest tip here when facing that scenario is to break it up into smaller sections. You can see that I'm really focusing first of all on my placement of the main wrinkles that I see and the lights and the darks. Now if I can break it up into these smaller, more manageable tasks, the reference photo is going to become far easier to work through. If I try to block in all of my base layer at one time for the entire subject, I'm going to get very confused, more stressed, and I'm going to hesitate a lot more. Now once I was happy with that base layer, I could then start to work with my putty eraser and enforce some more of my highlights. Now it's really important to make sure that we don't jump into our darkest values too soon. If you do have a particularly bright highlight, as I've mentioned in the eye, then you can allow the white of the paper to show through and work around those highlights initially. We can always darken them up later if needed. But when it does come down to the darker values, I do find that we capture more depth and realism when the darker shades are built up gradually. Here is a great example of that. I'm not really focusing on any superficial top detail. I'm still establishing more of those creases closer to the skin, but I do want to be making sure that I'm doing it in that gradual layering process. One of the main reasons is it enables us to get a range of our darker values rather than one solid dark value caused by us using our softest, darkest pencil right away. Now one of the most common questions I'm asked is, why do the erasers not work to pull in the highlights over the top of layers of graphite? Now this is a great question, and it's something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time step-by-step tutorials, which if they are of interest are linked in the description below. Now one of the most common causes of erasers of any kind not working is if the layering process of the graphite is incorrect. One of the common causes is burnishing too soon. Now burnishing is where we apply too much pressure and flatten the tooth of the paper. So what that does is it makes that eraser far harder to remove that graphite if it's been wedged and forced into the paper, especially if burnishing is used at the earlier stages. So certainly being aware of how much pressure we're applying is a key factor on how effective the erasers are. And of course, it also depends on what type of highlight we want to create. Here I wanted it to be a little bit softer, so I'm using my putty eraser. But the putty eraser is never going to be able to give me a brighter highlight compared to the battery eraser that I'm using here. So which eraser we use, depending on the highlight effect we're trying to create, also needs to be considered. Now, one common problem is that we have a tendency to want to put in too many details too early on in the layering process. At this stage here, this would look like I'm able to add in my top layers of detail, hinting at that skin where the brightest highlights are. But instead, I'm actually using my graphite pencils to enhance that base layer and get that contrast where it should be. Now, it is fairly scary, especially if we're newer to using graphite, to go as dark as what is needed at a base layer stage. We often have that fear that we're not able to then go lighter if we need to for our highlights. The problem with that is it can really limit the amount of realism that we capture. If the layers are too light overall, then the artwork is going to be very flat. So being confident with how dark our layers of graphite need to be is certainly something that comes more with practice and the more that we use the medium, but always knowing that if the layering process is correct, we can still pull in a fairly bright highlight over a very dark layer of graphite if needed. Now, I do have a black pug tutorial here on YouTube, and there I show how dark the layers of graphite can go and how we can even pull the brightest highlights of whiskers over the top of a very dark layer. So if that is of interest and the techniques associated with that, then I'll link that video in the description below. Now, as I've been working on this ear, a top priority for this section is to make sure that it looks out of focus. Now, I don't want it to be completely blurry, there still needs to be some definition. But you can see that my edges are a lot softer to make it look like it is just a little bit blurry, as I say. Now, a part of this is to make sure that we don't work with sharp pencils. If, for example, you're drawing a landscape and you've got some trees that are very much in the distance, working with a sharper pencil is more likely to encourage us to add more detail, even though we're aware we shouldn't be doing it. So working with a blunt pencil can make elements like this much easier. Now, the next very important stage of this drawing was the hair around the face. Now, this section is where the hair is very dark, so like what I've mentioned a moment ago with the pug tutorial, I'm going to have to make sure that I have the right layering process to enable some of the lighter highlights on the hair to be visible. But I want to be making sure, first of all, that I've got my contrast correct. I need to make sure that my shadows are really dark where needed, so that I've got as much shape and form captured here. Now, this again is a prime example of what I've mentioned throughout this video, making sure that I'm building up my values in stages. You'll see here that this is a very gradual layering process. I want to be capturing as many of the hairs as possible without overdoing it. Now, just like what I mentioned with the smaller sections such as the eye and being realistic with how many details I can include, I know I can't add in every single hair that I can see in my reference photo. In order to capture that level of realism, I'd have to work on a much bigger scale. But instead, to still capture the realism, I need to get about the right number for the size of the area I'm working on, and then making sure that I've got that value right. So to make this easier, because this fur, the hair, would be very complex and overwhelming, I'm breaking it up into more of those clumps. So where I can see some of those main established shadows, I'm going to begin there, then I can start to fill in the gaps in between. If I'm able to break it up like this, even the most complex fur and hair textures are much easier to tackle. Now, when drawing the nose of any animal, the shape can start to change very quickly without us even realising it. Now, most of the time this is usually caused by the nostrils not being in the right place. They might be potentially too big or too small. So my first consideration here is to make sure that I have mapped that in accurately. Once I've got the nostrils in place, I can then start to focus on the rest of the nose. Now, the chimpanzee has quite a unique nose shape, so I don't really necessarily have to focus on the standard, more open, rounded nostrils that we would see on a dog. But I do still want to make sure that I've got these diagonal slopes in the right way and that they are curved. I don't want any straight edges here. And as always, my base layer is a key part of my drawing process. This base layer is significantly lighter than anywhere else I've drawn so far, but that's because this section of the face is much brighter overall. Now once I've got my graphite powder established, I can then start using my graphite pencils to tidy those values up. I want to be making sure that any slight curves, the ridges of the nose are captured. This is really going to help with the shape and form of this area. Now one key part of establishing this is making sure that the lights and darks are in the right place. The main highlights and shadows are not random, they follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. For example, here where I'm using my putty, putting in my highlights on the areas where it starts to curve over. If I add these highlights in the incorrect place, then I'm actually going to potentially make the nose have extra bumps on there. I'm going to change potentially the nose position slightly if the highlight is positioned too far over to the side, for example. So I do really want to make sure that I'm not just adding random highlights where they shouldn't be, because I will change that structure of the face. Now as I progress through here and start working on the mouth, this is where I do think the portrait, the reference photo, would be really confusing. These creases, they are going to help with that shape and form, just like the highlights and shadows I've mentioned. So I don't want to have any straight lines here at all. They should be curving to follow the shape of where the teeth would be underneath this lip, or even just the section of the nose where it attaches to the mouth, the cheeks and so on. The jaw position is also going to affect the way that these lines are curved. Now something that is really important, and things that I mention throughout the drawing process in my real-time tutorials, is how usually an area of a drawing may not look accurate, but it might be that it's not just complete. Here when I start working on my highlights and adding in more contrast, this makes my darker sections of the creases and the wrinkles appear darker because I'm brightening up what's next to it. And it helps then to add far more shape and form. It's not that I've drawn anything inaccurate, it's just that the drawing isn't finished. Now this is a common problem with any medium, in that we are more likely to call an artwork finished too soon, especially if the area is more challenging. If maybe we've worked on an area and we feel like we've achieved quite a lot, and we're worried about then ruining it, we might then not continue with that layering process to help finish that area as it should. Now ultimately what this means is we're restricting ourselves with what we can achieve in our end results and in our finished drawings. One thing here is we need to be making sure that we are constantly telling ourselves that we can't really ruin it. Unless we spill something on our paper or we put a hole through the paper, anything here can be adjusted, as long as the right layering process is used. Now I think this area of the chin is one of those sections where we could actually call it finished too soon because it looks very confusing. If I was to start to jump in with more of my details too early on, I would actually make the hairs here look more like spaghetti. That can then make us feel like we're not really doing a good job, but it's just that we need to adjust the technique. We're not necessarily doing anything that is detrimental at all to the drawing process. Now the worst case scenario here is if I'd have used this eraser and they were looking like spaghetti, I could just use more of my graphite powder, cover it up and then try again. Working with this technique, especially when using graphite powder as a base foundation, allows for a far more of a forgiving layering process that makes making mistakes far easier to fix. This is one of the reasons why I love working with graphite powder. I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I talk about the benefits of graphite powder for many different subjects. So here is a great example. I did add some highlights, I didn't like them, so I took some darker graphite powder, covered that up and made that area of my base layer darker, which was what the problem was. Once I'd then worked on the area of the mouth, the lips, I could come back to the chin later on when my eyes were rested and then have a look at it with fresh eyes. Being able to take a step back from our drawings like times like this, especially when the area we know we're going to get quite overwhelmed with, those periods away and breaks from the drawing are just as important as the drawing itself. Now, one of the reasons why I was having such a hard time visualising the details on the chin and those white hairs is because I didn't have the hair underneath it mapped in. Now, this again is one of those times where a drawing section, it may not look accurate because the area next to it isn't in place. So I actually put that drawing away for that evening, came back to it the following day and started working on the black hair on the shoulder. Now by mapping this in, I'm going to then be able to judge how light those chin hairs need to be, because I'll have all of the darker hair around it in place. And this is something I mention often in my videos here on YouTube. Being able to work with the correct order of that layering process can really help simplify the whole layering process in general. Because if I'd have spent all of that time getting the white hairs on the chin mapped in, I'd then have to come in with my darker pencils and work around all of those details later on. That is actually far more time consuming and more fiddly. So I would much rather work with what's underneath, which although here it's going to be very dark, I then know that I've got all of that established, and then I can put the hairs that are over the top on the very bottom of the chin as they naturally are on this chimpanzee. Now just quickly to mention here, now that I've started to establish more of the really dark hair on the shoulder, the neck area, you can see that the face now, the highlights are standing out that much more. And that's because what's next to it is darker. So now when I come back in with my Tombow Mono Eraser here, I am able to now capture these brighter highlights because it's got enough graphite underneath to remove. If we're working with our erasers and the layers underneath aren't dark enough, those highlights will not appear as bright because it doesn't have that contrast next to it. So this really is a big factor. Although it is scary to go dark with graphite at that base where we know we're going to have to use our erasers for highlights, the erasers, the highlights are not going to be as effective if that base layer isn't dark enough. Now, one thing that I would recommend for overcoming that fear is to work on smaller studies. So maybe just take the section of this chimpanzee on the shoulder, just work on that for a small 4x6" size. You can practice the techniques without then being overwhelmed that we might ruin all of the work that we've put in so far. Those 1 or 2 hours spent on that little study where we're gaining confidence with the techniques are never time wasted, because we can then implement that in the real drawings without that pressure on ourselves that we're going to make a mistake. Now, to get this chin to the stage where it is here, I've implemented everything that I've mentioned so far. You've seen that I've actually had to darken quite a lot of this outer edge of the chin because my highlights weren't appearing up as much as I would like. That really is a clear indication that my layers underneath needed to be darker. But then we sit there and I was thinking, well, that means I've covered up some of my details that I mapped in initially. But I am more than happy to do that because I know by covering that up and then working with a slightly different technique that I'm going to achieve more realism. Now, when working with techniques and tools like this, there is no quick way to get to this end result. I am having to add in each individual highlight one by one. Now, I personally don't mind that because this area of the portrait, if it's not right, it's going to bring down the entire drawing. So I do want to be making sure that even if this took 1 or 2 hours, that I'm making sure that I am allocating that time to get that just right. Now, this technique didn't take as long as that, but it's certainly something to be aware of. I don't want to rush any of those techniques if it means that I can get the portrait done sooner, but my drawing is not going to be as realistic. And all of these techniques here I would be using if I was drawing the beard of a person. This would be very much a similar texture with these lighter overlapping hairs. Now, if you do have a hair texture like this, but you can also see some darker hairs in between, then I would recommend to use your graphite pencils and add those in at the relevant layer to which point that you can see those darker hairs at each stage of that layering process. So not necessarily all of those darker hairs would be attached closer to the skin. It may be that you notice them on top of the first layer of lighter hair, but then you've got some highlights over the top. So what I would recommend to do is put the lighter hair in first because that is closest to the skin. Then add in any of the darker hairs you notice, and then go back in with this technique and add your highlights over the top. What that will do is help to push those darker hairs further away, and then you're adding much more of that depth to that section of the drawing. Now, I have a specific way that I do like to draw hands and fingers of any animal or person, so my plan is to actually make a separate video for YouTube where I'm just focusing on the hand of this portrait. That will be coming up here on YouTube very soon. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload 2 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then all of the information to those is in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.